Max Verstappen just received the biggest championship lifeline of the entire season after a shocking midnight decision that erased both McLarens from the results. You will not believe how a few fractions of a millimeter destroyed the title hopes of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri in a way that has never happened before in modern Formula One. What you are about to hear completely rewrites the World Championship with only 2 races left, and the consequences are far bigger than anyone expected. The moment the officials completed the post-race inspections in Las Vegas, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to absolute shock because the measurements under both McLaren cars revealed a breach that no team can survive at this stage of the championship. The thickness of the skid blocks sat below the minimum required by the sporting code, and that single detail triggered the full weight of the regulations. This discovery created instant tension across the paddock because the night had ended with a comfortable podium for Lando Norris and a solid points finish for Oscar Piastri, yet within hours it became clear that none of it would stand. As the teams prepared for the flight to the next event, the entire championship narrative changed direction. When the officials confirmed the readings, the images of the table turning spread quickly among engineers and journalists who understood immediately what this meant for the standings. A technical offense of this kind carries an automatic exclusion, and there is no room for interpretation once the data is verified. The numbers taken by the inspection team showed were levels that went below the 9mm threshold, which is a foundational rule for ground effect aerodynamics in this era. Even small variations can generate significant performance differences, and for that reason the rule is enforced without exception. This is the type of scenario where a championship contender can lose months of progress in a single night. McLaren had hoped the initial checks might allow a more flexible interpretation, or that the measurements could be recalibrated, but the readings were reconfirmed with the presence of multiple team representatives. The equipment used for the inspection offered precision down to microscopic levels, and that removed any possibility of claiming measurement error. Once the technical delegates validated the repetition of the results, the decision moved out of the hands of the team and directly into the legal framework of the championship. Engineers who had celebrated only hours earlier now faced the realization that the floor design and ride height calculations for the night had fallen outside the permitted boundaries. This sequence of events completely reshaped the championship order because the points that Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri believed they had secured dissolved instantly. Before the disqualification, Norris held a commanding advantage over Max Verstappen and looked set to control the final chapters of the season from a position of strength. Yet once the tables updated, the gap shrank to only 24 points, and both Verstappen and Piastri suddenly found themselves back in range. This created a psychological storm in the team because every strategic plan for the end of the year depended on preserving that comfortable lead. Instead, McLaren must now wrestle with doubt and pressure they had hoped to avoid. The wider impact on the sport is enormous because this is the first time in the modern era that both cars from a leading team have been removed from the classification due to the same technical failure on the same night at such a decisive moment in the season. Fans across the world began analyzing the new possibilities and realizing that the World Championship was no longer a duel but a full 3-way confrontation. The dynamic shifted so dramatically that the competitive balance of the final 2 rounds is now completely recalculated. What had looked like a controlled march toward a maiden title for Norris now feels like a battle pitched on uncertain ground. This whirlwind of developments hands Verstappen an opening that appeared closed just hours earlier because a margin that once required extraordinary luck now sits within attainable reach. The Dutch driver enters the final 2 rounds with renewed belief, while McLaren faces the heavy burden of protecting a vulnerable lead under maximum scrutiny. This mixture of opportunity and pressure sets the stage for a climax shaped by resilience, execution, and nerve. Everything that follows stems from this single night in Las Vegas, when a few fractions of thickness rewrote the future of the season. This was only the beginning of a storm that is far from over. The technical readings recorded during the Las Vegas inspections provided a level of clarity that left no possible avenue for defense because the measurements demonstrated precise values that fell under the required threshold. Oscar Piastri's car presented figures as low as 8.74mm on the front right reference point, while the remaining surfaces hovered just below 8.9mm. These numbers are not estimates and were taken with equipment capable of detecting variations smaller than a single strand of hair. When these readings are below the regulation minimum of 9mm, the rulebook leaves no ambiguity. This is why the officials moved with absolute conviction once the figures were confirmed. The car of Lando Norris showed a similar pattern with wear readings that settled at 8.88 mm on the front right and 8.93 mm on the rear right. Those values might appear small, but in the world of ground effect engineering, fractions of a millimeter dictate how the floor compresses against the asphalt and how the airflow stabilizes under load. When the floor drops too low, the aerodynamic platform gains efficiency at moments it should not, and that is precisely why the regulation exists. The rule does not judge intent and does not investigate advantage. It simply protects the integrity of the aerodynamic package across the entire grid. Each of these measurements was taken in the presence of McLaren representatives who requested repeated checks to ensure no irregularity in the procedure. The officials obliged and followed the same method validated throughout the season, including earlier cases from other teams. The readings did not change and the equipment used confirmed precision at levels beyond what any argument could challenge. This gave the officials absolute confidence in the accuracy of the measurements and eliminated any possibility for McLaren to present a technical appeal based on procedural grounds. Once the verification concluded, the team knew the consequences were unavoidable. The timing of the announcement shocked the paddock because it arrived more than 4 hours after the checkered flag and during a period when teams normally wind down from the intensity of the event. Max Verstappen had already completed his media duties and left the immediate circuit area before learning that the order behind him would be erased. Journalists who remained on site described the mood as tense and uncertain as rumors began to circulate that something significant was developing between the officials and the McLaren camp. When the final document appeared, it confirmed that both cars were excluded and that the results needed immediate recalculation. The recalculation removed 18 points from Norris and 12 points from Piastri, which produced a dramatic shift in the championship leaderboard. Instead of controlling a lead of more than 40 points, Norris saw his advantage collapse to only 24, while Piastri dropped into a direct tie with Verstappen at 366 each. This was the type of swing that analysts usually associate with mechanical failure mid-season rather than a post-race technical ruling. The fact that it occurred at the closing stages of the year intensified the magnitude of the moment and forced every team to evaluate again the entire strategic outlook for the remaining rounds. The most striking aspect of these updated standings is the psychological effect they produce on the three contenders, because Norris loses comfort, Piastri loses momentum, and Verstappen gains belief. The Dutch driver understands the mathematics with perfect clarity and knows that the deficit no longer requires miracles but consistency and pressure. Meanwhile, McLaren must confront the reality that a technical error erased what could have been a decisive step toward a maiden title. These facts are what transform a technical document into a competitive earthquake and why the sport now enters Qatar with renewed tension. The technical reasoning behind the disqualification begins with the aerodynamic behavior of ground effect cars, which depend on precise control of ride height to manage airflow beneath the chassis. When engineers set the car too low in pursuit of maximum efficiency, the floor can strike the surface repeatedly at high speed, which accelerates the erosion of the skid blocks. McLaren explained that during the Las Vegas weekend the team experienced unexpected oscillations known as porpoising that increased downward load at specific sections of the circuit. These oscillations exposed the skid blocks to an intensity of contact far beyond the predicted model. Engineers rely on practice data to calibrate these effects, but the limited track time during the weekend compromised their ability to refine the setup. The practice schedule was heavily disrupted by weather and by incidents involving loose manhole covers, which forced extended stoppages. With reduced running time, the team faced a narrower window to gather reliable data on tire behavior and car dynamics. Ride height adjustments must strike a perfect balance between performance and durability, yet without consistent laps at representative speed the models that underpin those calculations remain incomplete. This is why McLaren referenced the constrained conditions as a contributing factor, because the team calculated their parameters on a smaller and less accurate feedback loop than what they typically require for circuits with such high average speeds. Engineers also detailed that minor contact during the opening laps may have introduced subtle changes in the positioning of the floor or surrounding components. Oscar Piastri experienced early wheel-to-wheel contact that forced an unexpected pit stop and may have delivered secondary impacts to the lower structure of the chassis. Even small displacements in the floor assembly can redistribute aerodynamic load and produce unpredictable wear. The officials acknowledged the possibility of accidental damage but concluded that its presence does not lessen the responsibility of the team to present a conforming car at every stage of competition. This reinforced the principle that outcome does not override regulation. Another critical detail is the way the aerodynamic platform reacts at the highest speed portions of the Las Vegas layout. The track features extended straights where the car travels close to its maximum speed for prolonged periods, which increases the compression of the suspension and magnifies the influence of vertical aerodynamic load. When this compression aligns with surface irregularities, the floor oscillates with higher frequency and grinds the skid blocks down more aggressively. These factors become even more significant when drivers push at the limit for long stints without the tire degradation that normally moderates pace. The Las Vegas event produced lower degradation than anticipated, which further amplified the wear. The FIA followed the established procedure defined in the technical directive and conducted the inspection with calibrated tools certified to a margin of error too small to influence the result. This part of the process is vital because it confirms that the readings are not subject to subjective interpretation and that the ruling must follow past precedents. The officials referenced earlier cases in the same season where similar infractions resulted in identical penalties regardless of the magnitude of the breach. Intent is acknowledged but irrelevant because the regulation exists to protect competitive balance. This meant that even though the officials recognized the error as unintentional, the outcome could not be anything other than exclusion.